The West never forgets. Not the storms, not the wounds, and certainly not the acts of mercy that ripple louder than thunder. It was near sundown when he first heard it, soft at first, like the wind playing tricks through the pine. A sound that didn't belong to the forest or to any creature he knew. He dismounted slowly, hand resting on the old rifle strapped to his saddle. But what he found beneath the thicket wasn't a threat. It was a child, no more than 6, barefoot, trembling, and blind. Her tiny hands reached out toward a world she couldn't see, her face streaked with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. She was lost, alone, and she didn't even know which way the sun had gone. His name was Jonah Briggs, a widowed rancher who had built his life in silence after burying too many memories. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words in a day since his wife passed. But something about that child stopped time. He didn't ask questions. He didn't think about the danger of harboring a native child, not in a region where tensions still burned beneath the soil. He just took off his coat, wrapped it around her, and carried her home. His cabin wasn't made for guests, much less sacred lives. But that night, by firelight and whispered lullabies remembered from a different time, something in Jonah's world cracked wide open. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was in a tongue he didn't know. But fear has a language of its own, and so does gentleness. He fed her broth, set a cot by the fire, and stayed awake just to be sure she knew she wasn't alone anymore. And as the wind howled through the valley like 1,000 old regrets, he sat beside her, humming an old hymn his wife used to sing when the world felt too big. A blind Apache child, held in the arms of a man who hadn't touched hope in years. 2 broken pieces of different stories, finding shelter in the same storm. He didn't expect anything in return. In the West, you did what was right because it was right, not because you wanted to be remembered for it. So when he woke the next morning and heard the sounds of axes, hammers, and quiet chanting outside his door, Jonah thought he was dreaming. But when he stepped onto his porch, boots sinking into the soft earth, he saw them, dozens of Apache men and women, working together in silence, rebuilding his barn, beam by beam, with more care than he had ever shown it himself. They didn't explain why. They didn't need to, because some debts aren't repaid in words. They're paid in honor, in presence, in doing something no one else would. Jonah had taken in one of their most vulnerable, expecting nothing, and in return, the tribe gave him something he had long stopped believing in: community. And perhaps more than that, a sense that the land itself had taken notice. That maybe, just maybe, in a world shaped by conflict and loss, grace could still echo through the trees and come back with strong hands, silent steps, and a heart full of memory. Jonah Briggs had never been the kind of man to expect anything from others. Life had carved that out of him long ago, the way wind shapes rock, slowly but permanently. After losing his wife and son to the fever that swept the valley 5 winters ago, he kept to himself, tending his small ranch with mechanical precision and the quiet grief of a man who had made peace with loneliness. But that morning, as the tribe's warriors hauled fresh-cut timber onto his land, and the women hummed as they prepared food near the creek, Jonah felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Disbelief wrapped in awe. He stood there, hat in hand, boots in mud, watching his barn, once a splintered memory of what he'd failed to protect, rise anew under the hands of people who had every reason to distrust him. The tribe didn't speak much, and neither did he. But their presence was louder than words. Each plank hammered, each joint tightened, carried meaning. They were not there out of obligation. They were there because the blind girl he had found, whom he now knew was named Salali, was the granddaughter of a respected Apache elder. And Jonah had not just sheltered her. He had given her warmth when the world had offered only shadows. That day, Salali never left his side. Though she couldn't see the faces or the hands working in the distance, she seemed to sense everything: the rhythm of the hammers, the vibration of the earth beneath her feet, the way Jonah's voice softened when he described what was happening around them. He spoke gently, describing each color, each motion, every face he could remember. And in return, she smiled, a smile so full it lit corners of Jonah's soul that had been dark for years. He didn't realize it then, but he wasn't just rebuilding a barn. He was rebuilding himself, plank by invisible plank. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of burnt gold and blood orange. The tribe gathered in a circle around a fire. Jonah was invited, not by words, but by a single hand extended by Salali's uncle, a tall man with storm-colored eyes and a voice that sounded like gravel and rain. They shared food, laughter, stories spoken in a language Jonah didn't understand but somehow felt. And in that moment, under the open sky, surrounded by people he'd once only known through fear and rumor, Jonah felt something shift inside him, like the first thaw after a long, hard freeze. That night, as he lay beside the fire outside, too full of feeling to sleep indoors, Jonah looked at the stars and whispered the name he'd once stopped saying aloud. Miriam, his wife. He told her about the girl, about the barn, about how strangers had become something more than neighbors. He didn't know if she could hear him, but as the wind rustled the leaves above, he felt a stillness settle in his chest that he hadn't known in years. A peace that felt borrowed from a dream. The kind of peace that comes not from getting what you want, but from giving without asking why. The days that followed unfolded like pages in a book Jonah hadn't known he was writing. The barn, now sturdier and more beautiful than ever, stood as a symbol, both to him and to the townsfolk who passed his land with narrowed eyes and murmurs of confusion. Indians built that, they'd ask. For him. But Jonah didn't explain. He didn't need to. Some stories, he figured, weren't meant to be defended. They were meant to be lived, quietly and completely, like the sun rising without permission. Salali remained at the ranch, and though she never spoke of returning to her tribe full-time, her presence was constant. She moved through the cabin by feel, learned where every floorboard creaked, and helped Jonah in small, unexpected ways. She'd listen to the wind and tell him when the weather would change. She'd touch the earth and know where to plant. He started calling her his compass, and though she never responded, her soft laugh told him she accepted the name with grace. The child he had once found crying in the woods had now become the heartbeat of his home. It wasn't long before others began to notice. A rancher named Miles stopped by with a broken axle, hoping Jonah might have spare tools. He paused at the sight of Salali feeding chickens barefoot in the yard. "That the girl?" he asked. Jonah simply nodded. "Looks like she belongs here," Miles said after a long silence. That was all. But from that moment, word began to spread, not of fear, but of change. A man once known for silence and sorrow was now the center of something quietly extraordinary. Then came the early frost. It arrived weeks ahead of schedule, biting through the valley with cruel intent. Many families weren't ready. Crops froze. Livestock suffered. But Jonah's barn stood firm. His new roof held strong. And inside that barn, where shadows once lingered, Salali sat each night weaving blankets taught to her by the women of her tribe. Jonah helped, clumsy but willing, learning stitches alongside her. They made enough to share. And so, he did, riding out each morning with bundles wrapped in burlap, handing them to neighbors who had never so much as waved at him before. He never asked for thanks. And still, the tribe watched over them, quiet sentinels among the trees, appearing now and then with dried meat, medicine, or simply a look that said, "We remember." Jonah understood now. This wasn't charity. This wasn't some ceremonial debt. It was kinship, raw, real, and earned. And as Salali curled beside the hearth each evening, her hands wrapped around warm tea and her head resting against Jonah's shoulder, he realized something he hadn't dared believe in years. The family he thought he'd lost had returned in a form he never expected, and it had begun with a child's cry in the woods. As winter deepened, the land transformed into a canvas of stillness and survival. Snow blanketed the hills, muffling sound and memory alike. For Jonah, the season no longer represented mourning. It became a reminder of what could grow even in the coldest soil. He and Salali had built a rhythm that no one expected, chopping firewood together, counting steps from the cabin to the barn, listening to birds she could never see but always recognized by sound. In her silence, there was understanding. In her blindness, clarity. She taught Jonah how to see again, not with his eyes, but with his soul. Each night, as wind howled through the valley like an old hymn, Jonah would read aloud to her. Not just scripture or tales from his youth, but stories he'd begun writing about her. About that night in the woods. About the tribe rebuilding his barn without asking for his name. He read with a voice he never knew he had, gentle, proud, full of reverence. And Salali would listen, head tilted slightly, lips turned upward in the kind of smile that felt like a sunrise against the cold. What started as a rescue had turned into redemption for them both. But the world outside their small haven had not forgotten old grudges. One morning, tracks were found near the fence. Boot prints, not tribal moccasins, deep and deliberate. Whoever had been there was watching, too afraid to come closer, but too angry to let go. That evening, a rock was hurled through Jonah's window, wrapped in twine and scrawled with one word, traitor. The old Jonah might have gone to town, demanded answers, shouted into the silence. But this Jonah didn't move. He picked up the rock, placed it on the mantel beside Salali's drawings, and sat back down. Salali, sensing his quiet pain, reached for his hand. Her fingers, small and cold, closed around his like roots seeking soil. "We are not afraid," she said, her first full sentence since arriving. Jonah stared at her, startled by the sudden voice, but said nothing. He simply nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of those 4 words. They were not defiance. They were truth. And in that moment, as snow fell quietly outside, Jonah felt something burn inside his chest. Not anger, not vengeance, just a steady, fierce resolve to protect the world they'd created together. The next morning, he rode into town, not to confront, but to be seen. He bought flour, salt, and a new pane of glass. He greeted each man who passed him, met their glances without flinching. He was no longer a ghost among them. He was a man with something worth defending. The whispers returned, yes, but so did the nods. A few even helped him load his wagon. And as he returned to his land, with Salali's laughter echoing from a barn, Jonah knew the winds had started to shift, not by force, but by quiet, persistent grace. By the time the first green shoots pierced the snow, Jonah's ranch had become more than a homestead. It had become a sanctuary. Word had spread beyond Dry Creek. Travelers passing through were told of a blind Apache girl who could name birds by sound, and a rancher who had once buried his heart, only to find it again in child's voice. They came not to gawk, but to listen. Some brought goods. Others brought stories. A few brought silence, content just to sit on the porch and share in the peace that seemed to hang over Jonah's land like morning mist. Spring revealed what winter had hidden. The barn, rebuilt by tribal hands, had not only withstood the frost, it had become stronger for it. Jonah opened its doors to those in need. Neighbors who had lost livestock, young boys who needed help fixing their tack, even mothers seeking herbs from Salali's careful collection. She had learned medicine from her people, and with Jonah's help, she labeled jars and raised markings, teaching herself and others how to heal with what the land offered. Her blindness was never mentioned anymore, not because people ignored it, but because they had come to understand it didn't define her. One afternoon, the tribe returned, not as builders or guardians, but as guests. A feast was held beneath the flowering cottonwoods. Bison meat roasted slowly, sweetened with berries and fire. Jonah sat beside the chief, Salali's grandfather, who had once doubted whether the white man could be trusted. They didn't speak much, but when the elders stood to offer a blessing in his language, and Jonah removed his hat and bowed his head, the entire circle knew a bridge had been built that no flood could wash away. It was at that feast that Salali was given a name in Jonah's tongue, Hope. She accepted it without hesitation, placing her hand over her heart when it was spoken. And in return, Jonah was given a name in theirs, Tahani, which meant the one who listens to the forest. The names were not ceremony. They were truth. Each had saved the other in ways words could never fully explain. And in that moment, beneath trees that had once witnessed war and silence, 2 worlds sat side by side, and no one felt the need to look away. The days grew longer, and so did the memories. Jonah began carving a bench outside the barn, etching it with stories, symbols of wolves, of children, of falling stars and open hands. Salali helped, feeling the grooves with her fingertips, adding shapes of her own. And when people passed through, they were invited to sit, to rest, to add their own mark. It became a kind of living monument, not to heroism, but to healing. Because in the Old West, where survival had long been the only language spoken, Jonah and Salali had taught the valley something new. That mercy, once given, has a way of echoing louder than any bullet ever could. Summer came with a gentleness the valley hadn't known in years. The rains were kind, the crops generous, and the air held more laughter than tension. On Jonah's land, the once withered garden flourished, the barn stood tall, and Salali, now called Hope by all who visited, had become a symbol not of pity, but of strength. Children from nearby ranches would come just to walk the field with her, learning how to navigate using sound and wind. She taught them to listen, to really listen, the way the grass sways when a deer moves through it, the way silence deepens before rain. Jonah watched it all, quiet and humbled, as if witnessing something holy. But peace, even hard-earned, rarely comes without testing. One afternoon, while tending to his horses, Jonah saw a rider approaching fast, dust trailing behind him like smoke from a fuse. It was Levi Harding, a landowner from the southern ridge. Years ago, Jonah and Levi had stood on opposite sides of many things: water rights, cattle lines, pride. Levi dismounted without a word, his face pale. "My boy," he said. "He's sick. Fever. Nothing's working." He didn't beg. He didn't explain why he'd come. He didn't have to. Jonah simply nodded and called for Hope. Within minutes, they rode together, Jonah, Hope, and Levi, carrying jars of herbs, cloths soaked in willow bark, and water from the spring that the tribe considered sacred. The boy was pale and trembling, but Hope moved with certainty, her hands delicate and sure. She worked in silence, whispering chants her grandmother had taught her, laying compresses across the boy's chest, while Jonah kept the fire lit and the room warm. After hours of tending, the boy finally slept, his breath slowing, color returning. Levi stood in the doorway, eyes rimmed red, unable to speak. He finally managed 2 words: "Thank you." But Jonah shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said, looking at Hope, who sat by the child's side, one hand resting over his. Levi looked at her for a long moment before kneeling and placing his hat over his heart. That image would remain in the valley's memory longer than any battle or storm. A proud man kneeling before the child he had once feared, now recognizing the miracle in her touch. News of it spread without need for exaggeration. The ranchers began to see the blind Apache girl not as a mystery, but as a blessing. From then on, Jonah's home was never truly empty. Strangers came, not just for help, but for something deeper, to remember how humanity once looked before borders, bullets, and bitterness. They brought firewood, cloth, books for Jonah to read to Hope. Some brought tears, finally brave enough to say what they buried. And as Jonah sat by the porch each evening, Hope beside him with her bare feet dangling off the steps, he understood something he never thought he would again. The West hadn't tamed him. It had saved him, not through strength, but through a child's cry and everything that followed. The days grew slower, richer. Jonah started each morning not with silence, but with song, soft melodies his wife once sang while kneading bread or brushing her son's hair. Hope had memorized them, humming along in perfect pitch, her voice weaving with the wind in a way that made the trees seem to lean in and listen. Their home had changed. The once lonely cabin was now lined with carvings, herbs hanging from the beams, and hand-woven baskets brimming with stories of visitors who came broken and left whole. Hope's touch was not just healing, it was transformational. One summer evening, a traveling photographer stopped at the ranch. He had heard of the girl with the songs, and the barn built by Peace. With quiet reverence, he asked to take a photograph of them, Jonah and Hope, standing in front of the barn as the sun melted into the ridge behind them. Hope wore her beaded vest, fingers gently resting on the wooden cane Dakota had carved for her. Jonah, weathered and tall, stood beside her with one hand on her shoulder. The photograph would one day hang in the schoolhouse, in town halls, in books, not because they were famous, but because they were proof that kindness could bend history. But not all moments were bright. One night, Jonah fell ill. A fever, slow but steady, took hold. Hope, now older, cared for him the way he had once cared for her, sitting through the night, reading back his own words from journals he thought she hadn't noticed. "You said mercy is the strongest kind of bravery," she whispered. "So now, be brave for me. He smiled weakly. "You listen too well," he said. She held his hand, pressing her forehead against it. For days, the wind didn't howl. It waited. The tribe sent medicine. The neighbors brought broth, and hope never left his side. And then, he woke. The fever broke. Jonah opened his eyes one dawn to find Hope asleep beside the bed, her small hand still wrapped around his. His first thought wasn't of pain or age. It was of gratitude, so deep it made his chest ache. Not for his survival, but for the life they had made. One he had never asked for, but now could never imagine losing. That morning, he stood slowly, walked outside, and watched the sun rise over the barn rebuilt by strangers, warmed by stories, and sanctified by one act of selfless love in the woods. The summer carried on, but something had changed in Jonah. Not fear, but urgency. He began writing more, carving more, teaching Hope everything he knew about the land, about the language of clouds and cattle, of fences and forgiveness. She absorbed it all, not with her eyes, but with her entire being. The valley had become her classroom, and Jonah, without meaning to, had become not just her guardian, but her greatest teacher. And in every lesson, in every step she took beside him, it became clearer. The barn may have been rebuilt in wood, but their bond had been built in eternity. Autumn crept into the valley with the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. Leaves turned copper and gold, painting the hills like a farewell letter from summer. Jonah's steps grew slower, more deliberate, yet his presence never faded. He rose with the sun, rested when the work allowed, and watched Hope as she moved through the world he once walked alone. She had grown, taller, surer, filled with a quiet authority that came not from age, but from depth. Her blindness no longer limited her. It defined how deeply she experienced life, how closely she listened to it. They spent long afternoons by the creek, with Jonah carving new wooden animals while Hope traced the shapes with her fingertips. "Every story has texture," she told him once. "We just have to feel it." He smiled at that, thinking how little he'd known about the world before she entered it. Hope wasn't just a gift. She was a mirror, revealing parts of him he thought had died with Miriam and their boy. And now, as the air grew cooler, Jonah could feel a new kind of season settling in. Not on the land, but in his soul. A readiness. A calm. One crisp morning, Hope received a visitor, a young Apache woman from her tribe who had heard about the ranch and its quiet legend. She brought with her a letter, sealed in wax and marked with the symbol of her grandfather. The message was simple. "It's time." Hope folded the letter carefully, holding it to her chest before placing it in Jonah's hand. He read it in silence, then looked at her with eyes that said more than words ever could. She was being called back, not because she was leaving, but because she had become someone they needed to lead, to guide. A bridge, just like Jonah once was for her. Jonah didn't stop her. He simply helped her pack, braiding her herbs, wrapping the carved animals, folding the letters she had written over the years. When the day came for her to leave, they stood together on the porch as they always had, facing the hills. "This place is part of me," she said. "But you are me." Jonah nodded, voice rough. "Then take me with you in everything you do, and let the world know that mercy still grows out here." They embraced tightly, no tears, just time pressing against them like a closing door that neither of them feared. As Hope rode off with the tribe's escort, Jonah stood in the doorway of the barn. It wasn't empty anymore. It held stories, laughter, silence, healing. He touched the doorframe gently and exhaled, not with sorrow, but with completeness. He had once found a child crying in the woods and thought he was rescuing her. But now, with the land still and the wind carrying her song across the trees, he knew the truth. She had rescued him, and she had given the West something it rarely saw, a legacy made not of bullets or blood, but of bread, blankets, and open hands. The seasons passed with quiet dignity, and Jonah, though slower in his step, never ceased in his purpose. He wrote in a leather-bound book each evening, filling its pages with lessons about land, kindness, and the language of storms. People continued to visit, not for spectacle, but for wisdom. The story of hope had reached far, and those who arrived now came in silence, knowing they were walking the path of something sacred. Jonah would meet them on the porch, pour warm tea, and share only what was needed. What happened here, he would say, was never about me. It was about what happens when we stop seeing people as problems and start seeing them as promises. Letters arrived from Hope regularly, written by the hands of tribal scribes, carried by writers with reverence. She was leading ceremonies, teaching children, healing elders. She had become a weaver of traditions and futures. And each letter carried a closing phrase that Jonah cherished more than any title. I am still listening. Those words, echoing the heart of their bond, gave Jonah strength even as his body began to fade. He wasn't afraid. He had lived fully, not in the world's eyes, but in the spaces that mattered most. One late autumn, as the wind began to hint at snow, Jonah gathered every carving, every letter, every memory into the barn. He arranged them carefully, turning the space into something more than a shelter for animals. It became a shrine of sorts, not to himself, but to everything they had built. On the far wall, he placed a photograph taken so many seasons ago. He and Hope, standing in the golden light of a West that had been forever changed by their meeting. Beneath it, he carved the words, "Mercy rebuilds." That winter, the snow came heavy, blanketing the world in silence. Jonah didn't leave the cabin much, but when he did, he moved slowly through the drifts, touching trees, feeling their bark like old friends. One morning, as the sky turned a pale silver and the barn creaked beneath the weight of white, Jonah sat in his rocking chair, wrapped in the woven blanket Hope had once made. He closed his eyes, whispered a name not in grief, but in gratitude, and let the breath leave him as gently as it had once entered. And though the West would march on, louder, faster, more modern with each passing year, there in that quiet valley, where a blind child's tears once met the hands of a grieving man, something eternal had taken root. A story that would be told around fires, whispered in the tall grass, and passed from soul to soul, not because it was grand, but because it was true. The kind of story only the West, and hearts brave enough to love within it, could ever truly understand. When word of Jonah's passing reached the tribe, the valley seemed to fall into a hush, not one of shock, but of reverence. Hope was among the first to return, now a grown woman with presence in her step and wisdom in her voice. She didn't ride alone. With her came elders, children, and warriors, not in procession, but in pilgrimage. They came not to mourn a death, but to honor a life that had quietly redrawn the boundaries of what the West could be. Jonah's cabin was exactly as he'd left it, clean, warm, a journal resting on the table, open to a page with her name etched into the margins like a prayer. Hope walked the property in silence, every footstep an echo of memory. She touched the doorframe where she had once leaned as a child, unsure and afraid. She stepped into the barn where stories were carved in wood and felt with fingertips. She wept, not because he was gone, but because he had never truly left. Every board, every shadow, every hush in the trees whispered his name. And when she found the final carving beneath their photograph, "Mercy rebuilds," she sat beside it and laid her hand on the wood, as if it were his shoulder, still solid, still watching. That night, the tribe and the townsfolk gathered together under the stars. No fences, no rifles, no fear. Just firelight and memory. There were no speeches, only stories. A rancher told of the time Jonah gave him the last of his hay during a drought. An elder recalled how Jonah once spent 3 nights walking to the river with a feverish child in his arms, guided only by Hope's voice and moonlight. And when it was her turn, Hope stood tall, her hair braided with feathers and thread, her voice carrying through the dark. "He didn't save me," she said. "He welcomed me. And through that, we both were saved." The gathering continued until dawn, when the first light broke across the ridges. A new wooden marker stood beside the oak tree, where Jonah's body had been buried wrapped in the same woven blanket that had once warmed her shoulders. Hope planted sagebrush at the base, then stepped back as the wind moved through the branches like an old friend. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The land remembered him now, not as a lone rancher, but as a father, a friend, a bridge between what was and what could still be. And from that day forward, anyone who came through Dry Creek and asked about the barn with the carvings would be told the same thing. That's where Mercy built a home. Children were brought there to listen. Elders came to sit and feel the carvings. And hope returned each season, never missing a solstice, never letting the dust settle on what had been given to her. Because in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, Jonah Briggs had left behind something too loud to ignore, a life that proved even the hardest West could be softened by the simple act of reaching out and choosing to hold on. Years passed, and the ranch transformed into something larger than legacy. It became a place of learning, of healing, of storytelling. The barn, once a structure of necessity, now stood as a monument to human connection, etched with the handprints of children, layered with generations of new carvings added each spring. Visitors came not because it was marked on a map, but because it lived in word of mouth, in letters passed between hands, in fireside tales told with reverence. And every person who entered that space was invited to leave behind a piece of their own story, so it could grow beside Jonas. Hope became the caretaker, not just of land, but of memory. She taught young ones to listen, to trees, to wind, to silence. She taught them that blindness isn't about what you can't see, but about how much more deeply you feel. Her voice guided dozens of lives, but she never spoke of herself as special. "I was found," she'd say, "and then I stayed." Her presence, steady and soft, turned the ranch into a kind of compass for all who had lost their way. Not a sanctuary for the broken, but a home for the brave. There were seasons of hardship still, storms, losses, misunderstandings. But now, the valley met them with unity, not suspicion. When a wildfire threatened the northern hills, it was both ranchers and tribes who fought it. When illness returned, it was Hope and her people who brought herbs and comfort to every home, no matter who lived there. Jonah's story had planted something deeper than peace. It had sown a new identity for the valley, one where mercy wasn't just remembered, it was expected. On the 100th anniversary of Jonah's birth, the community gathered once more. Children who had never met him sang songs he used to hum. Elders who had once feared the tribe now passed on their stories beside the very people they once distrusted. And as the fire cracked beneath a silver sky, Hope stood before them all, holding Jonah's journal in her hands. She read from a page he had written not long before he died. "If kindness can echo, then let my echo live here." The wind picked up then, as if responding, and it did. It lives there still. In every child who leaves a carving in the barn, in every rancher who welcomes a stranger, in every piece of bread shared without asking why. Jonah Briggs didn't build a legacy with guns or gold. He built it with mercy, and the West, wild as it ever was, made room for it, quietly, reverently, and forever. In the unforgiving silence of the Old West, where men were often remembered for how hard they fought or how fiercely they defended their land, Jonah Briggs became a legend for something far rarer: how deeply he chose to care. He didn't save a child because it was safe or expected. He did it because something in her cry reached the part of him that grief hadn't yet silenced. And that decision, made with no witnesses, no reward, and no promise of safety, echoed far beyond the forest where he found her. It rebuilt more than a barn. It rebuilt lives, bridges, and the very soil of a fractured community. Jonah's story teaches us that true strength is not measured by the walls we build around ourselves, but by the lives we choose to let in. A blind child and a broken man, two seemingly powerless figures, rewrote what power looked like in a place shaped by dust and division. The barn they stood beneath became more than shelter. It became a symbol, not of charity, not of pity, but of profound mutual transformation, proof that sometimes we rescue each other without even knowing we need to be saved. In a world that often rewards noise, aggression, and self-preservation, this story offers a different path, one forged through stillness, compassion, and a willingness to act when no one else will. Jonah didn't have riches. Hope didn't have sight. But together, they built a legacy that outlived them both, a living monument to what it means to choose empathy in a place built on survival. Their story is a quiet thunder, reminding us that the smallest choices, offered from the heart, can carve the deepest canyons in history. So if you find yourself walking through life thinking your actions are too small to matter, remember Jonah. Remember hope. And remember that in the face of a world that often forgets to feel, your kindness might just be the spark that turns silence into song. Let their story sit with you. Let shape how you see others. Because sometimes, the person you save is the one you least expect, and sometimes, the soul you heal is your own. If this story moved you the way it was meant to, let it continue beyond this moment. Subscribe to the channel to hear more powerful stories like this one. Stories that don't just entertain, but awaken. Leave a comment sharing what part of Jonah's journey touched you most. And if you believe that compassion still belongs in the world, leave a like to help this message travel farther. Because stories like this aren't meant to be forgotten, they're meant to be passed on.